Welcome to the East Bay's best podcast, The Capstone Conversation. This is a show that interviews political, government, and community leaders in Alameda, Contra Costa, and Solano counties. We look at what is going on in your city, how are we developing things economically, and where are we going from here? I'm your host, Jared Asch. Jared Asch for the Capstone Conversation. Before we start with our speaker today, I just want to talk about the ACC and college sports for a second. As you've heard the news, the Cal Bears and Stanford Cardinals have joined the Atlantic Coast Conference. That's two schools that are within 20, 30 minutes of the Pacific Ocean are joining the Atlantic Coast Conference, which includes schools from Boston to Miami, with the furthest west being Louisville, Kentucky in there. This is going to have big ramifications. One of the big concerns, travel. They've talked about things like basketball or volleyball happening in the middle of the country, places like Dallas or Denver. I have to say, I'm excited. I am an ACC fan. I am a Florida State alumni. Go Seminoles. We are currently number 3 in the country in football. And as a football fan, I believe that at least once out of every 3 years, if not more often, Florida State will be out here playing football against the Cardinals or the Bears. And I'm excited about that potential to see my team more regularly. We have a big alumni club out here, and I'll be excited to get together with everybody and bring my family to a game. My mother-in-law, who's a Bear alumni, she's excited about it, thinks it'll be a great opportunity to bring everybody together. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Let me know your thoughts, right? Are you excited about Cal and Stanford joining the ACC, or are you not? I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and letting me get that out there. We're going to introduce Ed Del Beccaro of TRI Commercial Real Estate. Why are we talking to a commercial broker? Part of that is because for economic development to happen, there are multiple partners, and a city has to get the perspective of a broker because they are the ones that look for not only the locations for cities, but the time to approve permits, the possibility of zoning and the problems zoning may have. So I think you're going to find this an interesting take on how does a broker finding locations for clients, creating employment opportunities for cities, how do they want to work with cities, and how could a city better work with that broker? Thank you for joining us on today's Capstone Conversation. Ed is the San Francisco Bay Area Regional Manager for TRI Commercial Offices. He is personally out of the Walnut Creek area, but the region serves San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, among everything in between those 3 cities. He specializes in office sales, medical, retail properties, and mixed-use space. He has over 40 years in the space. He is the vice chair of the East Bay Development Association. He is a board member of the East Bay Leadership Council, and he is a member of the Diablo Valley Tech Institute, among other things that he could talk about in his background. Ed, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself today?
Yes. Thank you, Jared. As you mentioned, I've been in the real estate space 40 plus years, whether it's a commercial broker offering commercial brokerage services. I've also been in the property management space where I ran a property management division, managed some of my own buildings. I also do project consulting, and I also do consulting to cities and some developers or tenants. So I went to school out here, stayed. I was a philosophy major, which is why I'm in commercial real estate, married with 3 kids and 4 grandkids.
Great. And if our audience is wondering, why are we talking to a commercial broker today when we've been talking to mayors, city councilmen, chamber executives? Today is to get a broker's perspective on economic development and the permit process. How could cities work with brokers How can they partner with the real estate community to learn and better develop their cities into the best that they can be?
Actually a very good question. My day job is to assist companies in either relocating into our region or retaining companies. And the second part of the day job is to advise owners and developers where to invest and put their buildings. Where are the economic drivers going? What kinds of tenants? And tenants are different. A insurance company is different from a bank, is different from a life science, is different from a advanced manufacturing. So there's all kinds of factors that go into that decision, whether you're the tenant, the user, or whether you're the developer owner who hosts the building. And it's not just, I have a vacant piece of property or a vacant building, build it and they will come. So therefore, we live in the future as commercial brokers. We're looking at, I just got off a Zoom call with a major hospital that I represent, and we're talking about 225 and 230 timelines as to when we move and plan. And then what are the parameters and what do they need in terms of infrastructure and where? So we literally live 2 to 5 years down the road, which is the horizon of several of the economic development directors. So we can assist with that.
Well, that's a good perspective on how you help a company look at locating. Can you talk more about how do you help a company decide if it should, using that hospital as an example, where should they go next? How do you help them look at that? Or if you have somebody who wants to buy an office building, where should they go next? How do you help determine that?
So let's take a user. Let's make it a large user. The larger the user, let's say above 100 people, above 100,000 feet to 500,000 feet, they have to plan 2 to 5 years down the road. And this is usually a major relocation. So let's assume I'm moving a company out of San Francisco to the East Bay, Walnut Creek, Oakland, San Ramon, or equivalent, or to Sacramento or out of the area. So there's about 25 questions that they ask before they move. One is obviously the economics of the deal. What are the possible rent, purchase, whatever. But more importantly, they ask since I'm going to be hiring into retaining, where is my present workforce? And we can actually identify that with them. Where am I going to hire my future workforce? Then that entails, can I afford my future workforce if I'm in San Rafael, or if I'm in San Francisco, or if I'm in Fairfield or Walnut Creek? And housing enters into the factor. Transportation nodes enter into that factor. Business payroll taxes, how long it takes to get approvals. Uses are more complicated now. It's no longer just move into a building. I might have some uses that require a use permit of some sort. So all those factors, can I expand? So, I mean, there was a case history recently in a Silicon Valley tenant said, we're going to be upgrading and improving our infrastructure with machines every 6 months. We cannot go into your area or your building city if we have to get an approval each time. Can we get a blanket approval as long as we conform to the zoning? So things like that.
Along those lines with zonings and approvals and CUPs, all terms you mentioned, from a broker's perspective, what makes one city better than another? Talk specifically about that approval process.
Okay, so let's talk about that. First, we should talk about regional. So my workforce, we use what we call the phrase 360 commute shed. So depending upon the kind of tenant. So the original migration of tenants in the 80s and early 90s was from San Francisco to the greater East Bay. That's why you saw all the buildings built in San Ramon, Pleasanton, 680 Corridor, places like that. And one reason they moved is their workforce was there. So they followed the workforce in that case. So it wasn't that they didn't like San Francisco. So that's Chevron, that was Wells Fargo, that was B of A, Metropolitan Life Insurance, all the big users in that area. So they actually followed their workforce. And one reason why you follow your workforce, there's studies that if you have a one-way commute of over an hour and 10 minutes or an hour and a half one way, you're going to lose 40 to 50% of your workforce. Therefore, I might love San Francisco or I might love downtown LA, but I have to go where I think I can get my workforce. And where's my workforce of the future? So first of all, it's a regional decision before it's a city decision. So even if I locate in a city as central as Walnut Creek, I might have some of my workforce coming from Fairfield, Benicia, Richmond, Oakland, South San Francisco, and Tri-Valley. So what then? So therefore, the first question is, where is my workforce? Where is my future workforce? To answer the second question on where is my future workforce, I have a salary range that I can afford as a company. And the current insurance and banks are usually in the 60 to 130,000 range. You then work that backwards. If I hire somebody for 100,000, 120,000, will that person be able to pay rent or buy a house in a given region? If they can't, if the average apartment rents are 40,000 a year, if the average mortgage is 5,000 a year, 5,000 a month rather, then I have to move further afield. So that's why you see companies now leaving the inner bay, going to Sacramento and Austin region. Then within a region, once a decision is made that my current workforce is in a given region, let's say East Bay, then let's say the second thing is I know that I can afford my workforce over the next 10 years to live there and pay them the market rates. Then what city do I go to within a sub-region? There, every city is the best when you ask the cities, but then we make decisions based on location to transportation, locations relative to interchanges, locations relative to BART mass transit. Because again, if I have people coming in from 360 degrees, 20 miles, let's say to 40 miles away from any given point, if I'm in Fairfield, how do I get to East County? If I'm in Fairfield, how do I get to San Ramon? If I'm in Tracy, how do I get to Walnut Creek? Or if I'm in Fremont, how do I get to Walnut Creek? So then we try to centrally locate where most of those workers are. And then within that region, what cities have the better approval process? Because the new kinds of tenants that are coming into the region are not the back office tenants. That was pretty simple build out. Cubes, called them Dilbert farms. That's what you saw the original migration wave. Now we have laboratories, we have more involved IT, more involved investment in infrastructure and more complicated uses. So then the question is, if we're going to grow and expand, what city next to a transportation center can best accommodate our strategy of expansion and with approvals? And then second, what's the business environment? Some cities, unfortunately, in our area have raised their business payroll tax to extraordinarily high. They're in effect, some companies won't go there. You go next door.
Sure. All right. I want to hit on this permit process more. And how does the time to impact a decision matter? The time to approve permits and everything impact these businesses. And recently I met with the city of Vacaville and they talked about 90 days to approval. We talk about Fremont often comes up in meetings as they could fast track approval process. Yet, I was reading today about Richmond is trying to build a housing development, which was approved by planning in March, was filed in October of last year, has yet to come before city council. And already there's 3 lawsuits over people not wanting to build there. How does that time impact a decision? And how can cities then look to speed up the process?
It absolutely impacts the decision. Again, hiring and operations is what companies think about. Real estate, the box is secondary. So if I'm getting funding and I now have a laboratory grant to expand my laboratory from 10 to 50,000 feet, hire 30 more workers, that's my main goal, is to get up and running. So if the box is not going to be ready by the time I have the money and I can hire these people, I'm not going to move to that box. So real estate doesn't drive the decision, even though that's what I do for a living. It's the operation. And the operation then says, our investors gave us money to set up an operation, or we received special funding from a federal government or private enterprise, private fund, whatever the case. I have to hire 50 people and put them somewhere in 3 months to 6 months. So if I hear that the process is a year, I can't even consider that. I might like the building better if that takes a year, but my operation then hurts. And it's the operation that makes the money, brings in the revenue. So especially now in the advanced manufacturing and life science and biotech and advanced food production, you hear about Series 1 funding where Basically, I'm in incubator small space. I then get series 2 where I get enough money to hire 50 people. I want to be up and running in 90 days. So that's why you're hearing 4 different cities, Vacaville, Fremont, City of Alameda, have actually risen to the occasion and say, we will put in place zoning that expects these tenants. And therefore, when they apply, it's over the counter versus let's reinvent the wheel each time, have a public approval process, design review, planning commission, city council, and take a year. And then, by the way, then you have to get service hookup. PG&E is taking an extreme amount of time. Water, depending upon what water district. And all that adds to time, and time kills.
That's understandable. So elaborate on that. We were talking about time, but let's talk about specific zoning problems your clients run into with cities. You touched on a lot of it, particularly around the time. We talked about office space being in cubicles, having to be transformed. But what type of zoning problems have you recently run into? And maybe give 1 or 2 examples.
Okay, so I can do that. General office space is pretty easy. Okay, you have a building, a box, you have power, and you just design where you put your private offices and you go through the permit process. Unfortunately, most city current general plans across the Bay Area, with certain exceptions, are yesterday planning zonings. So for instance, if I'm a 10,000 foot, 40 person firm, I'm going to have cubicles for engineers, and I'm going to have an area for 3D printing to make proof of concept, small product run. And then I need a place to store product with a back door. Am I an office tenant? Am I an R&D tenant doing research? Am I a lab? Most zonings try to have black and white, mutual exclusive characterizations. And so there's no zoning in most cities for what I just described. So then we have to go get a use permit. They have to give me an exception to allow to do those 2 or 3 different operations inside the same envelope. And so why not plan for that, since that's the future tenant, and then do it over the counter? Again, I am competing as a company with 20 other companies around the world. Time is of the essence. I got to get my product out. If I don't get my product out in time, the investors walk away. So if I tell them I'm sitting in a city waiting for approval, they go, that's your problem. Now, then once we get approved, there's secondary timing issues. A lot of cities are compartmentalized on the inside. So the planning commission might have given you, and the building department gave you the permit, but they're not really watching what the inspectors are doing. So the inspectors then inspect, and they have certain standards of care. Not all of it's objective. And then they say, you have to do this. I thought this is all I had to do. Well, it'll come back in 30 days. And then all of a sudden there's another delay. And so some of the better cities now have what we call concierge services. They're very aware of what's happening once the approval begins and once that. And then they're there to problem solve, as opposed to, well, it's not 100%. You missed 1, 2, and 3 out of 20. We'll come back in 30 days. Sorry.
No, that's helpful. And a large number of cities want life science companies to move to their cities. First, can you define life science? Because there's different buckets of it, and cities might not be separating out those buckets. And then second, what makes one city more competitive than another? And I think a lot of these you've talked on: flexible zoning, which you just sort of alluded to. And then the next part is type, right? But can you elaborate more on the life science?
Yeah, again, it's going life science. There's, as you mentioned, there's several areas, buckets. It could be anything from A to laboratories, to manufacturing, to R&D, to research. Pure life science needs to be next to a research university. So there's a reason why you have Emeryville, City of Alameda, South San Francisco as major life science centers. You have Berkeley, University of California, you have Stanford, and you have UCSF. The professors in the ecosystem of research between the research institutes, plus we have 3 labs in the Bay Area. So you just can't take a life science company and move it to Reading. It just doesn't happen, because there's a back and forth between the universities, the labs, the military labs and the Genome Center, for instance, in Berkeley. And so therefore the professors sometimes have their own companies or sometimes they're doing research so life science in and of itself has to be in the inner bay, in those areas. So I would call that the 680 corridor. I would call that the 880 corridor, the 101 corridor, around those areas. That's why you see all the new buildings occurring in that. It's temporarily delayed because of the real estate bumps we're going through. The second thing then for a city is that it has to have, depending upon life science, remember life science could be life science with laboratories. If it's advanced food manufacturing, they need a lot of water. So if you have to have access to water. So for instance, Vacaville and Fairfield have access to Lake Berryessa, which is good water for laboratories and advanced food production. So that's a plus in their favor. Plus they have Davis nearby there as a research university. If it's manufacturing and doesn't entail water flushing, and that could be medical instruments, for instance. Fremont has developed into a node of a lot of advanced manufacturing. They also like to cluster. One reason they cluster is that ideas get exchanged between companies. Second is they can steal employees from each other, and they're very comfortable with that. So again, if you have isolated outposts 40 miles apart, there's not that exchange. And so that's why you see density occurring in South San Francisco. And that's why you see density occurring in Emeryville. That's why you see density occurring in parts of Tri-Valley. Then the other one is power. Are the cities investing in power infrastructure? Right now, because of all kinds of reasons, PG&E has to bury a lot of cables, transmission tower lines, et cetera. It could take a year plus to get a hookup for advanced power transformers. That becomes a factor. Ironically, the city of Alameda has its own power company. So they've had a migration of almost 1.9 million square feet of life science have gone into that city versus another service district. So all these are taken into account.
Okay, that's interesting. I appreciate that. You talked a bunch about ecosystems within that. Companies clustering together to build out an ecosystem. Further elaborate on that. Talked earlier about an example with Tesla that maybe you could share, or if there's anything else like that.
Yeah. So again, that cities have to think regionally. If what we call a major tenant moves into Fremont, it doesn't hurt Hayward, Castro Valley, or San Mateo. It helps. So wherever the big company lands, there's usually a 30-mile distance around, 40-mile that benefits. So in the case of Tesla, one reason why Tesla, when it, in its infancy, chose Fremont, it went into the Nuami Motors, the old Toyota facility. Already in place was an ecosystem. What does that mean in English? So right now, Tesla doesn't manufacture really, it assembles parts. So the fob manufacturer is in San Leandro. The person who makes the battery pack cover is in Hayward. So I can go down the list. Let's imagine there's 50 parts that go into the car. They're located in the surrounding community cities. And then Tesla asked the question, in their case, they have a 4-hour rule. We're working 3 shifts. We have some just-in-time product delivery. We want to make sure if we need 20 extra component parts in the supply chain, it's there. So therefore, the ecosystem becomes important. So again, the advantage of the Bay Area, the Inner Bay, the East Bay, is that in place are various elements of that ecosystem for advanced manufacturing. Some of these things can actually do 2 or 3 different companies. So the guy who makes the fob for Tesla could be doing another product for a different manufacturing process that uses the same kind of, let's say, software. What's interesting, by the way, would be the role of the secondary airports. People are looking at airports as freight hubs now, not Oakland, San Francisco. Let's say in the future, you can see Byron, Livermore, Buchanan, Fairfield, Hayward, San Mateo, Moffett Field as airports where you fly in product from another part of the state, and then it's delivered to Fremont or it's delivered to South San Francisco.
Sorry, I was just taking notes on that. That's good to talk about the use of airports and the roles they can play. It's often talked about Byron Airport, how they've gotten into drone testing. And I know Hayward Airport has 2 or 3 companies, including autonomous chopper company, and some others there. And it shows that there's only eventually so much that those people can do at the airport itself because they're small facilities, but it builds it further along. And I also remember a few years ago when the major car companies were in crisis, Chrysler and GM, Ford went and advocated for their loan bailouts from the federal government because Ford, who was in better financial shape, needed that key fob people to stay in business and not lose that second account because it's what kept their pricing low.
Correct.
Same with the tires or the axle companies. And it was all of those component parts that make a difference in that ecosystem.
Yes. So if a major company moves to Fremont, San Leandro benefits and vice versa.
So from a broker's perspective, what can a city do to attract a business? What tools in the Bay Area should we have?
There are several. And again, the city should first of all think of themselves as a sub-region. Yes, I want to keep a metric of how many jobs are created inside my individual city boundaries. So how many jobs did I create in Walnut Creek this year versus last year, et cetera. But on the other hand, Tesla is not going to move into Walnut Creek unless it has an ecosystem that spans the entire several county area and or its workforce. So on one level, the city should be talking regionally to each other about where is workforce housing, where is my power coming from, where's my water coming from, and then inside their cities, they should be talking about streamlining a process and real streamlining. And this has to be top down. And so streamlining is like Fremont did or Vacaville when we interviewed with Vacaville, is that we want these kinds of sectors to come into our city. We should do an interview process and see what they need. So that's one thing cities should do. Interview brokers and the actual employers. What do you need? What do you see you need? We then pre-approve with all the complications or mitigate any of the issues that you're kind of used to bring to the city. So therefore, when you say you're going to bring 50 people in a company to my city, you already have in place a process for swift approval over the counter versus a public hearing. Even the state has stepped in and limited for housing, in some cases, 5 public hearings now, because some cities were taking 20. You're talking about Richmond there, keep going back and forth, and there's not an end game. So cities should be talking to their neighbors. And then the other reason why they have to talk is that we have to get our transportation dollars. We're competing with areas within the Bay Area. We're competing with Southern California. We're competing with other states. We need for the East Bay to get our fair or unfair share of transportation dollars. So how do we talk together as a region? Again, if the roads aren't improved, if the mass transit isn't improved, et cetera, then it doesn't matter how good our city is, we lose as a region.
Yeah, those are some good points. I appreciate that. Now, I want to challenge everybody as one of those points. You talked about, has a city sat down with their broker community and asked them what difficulties have they had from businesses? And I want to challenge every city that's listening to this, whether it's an economic development person, a community development director, or a city manager. Go and challenge your city to meet with your broker community, engage a conversation with them and get feedback from somebody who's in there. And I also want to say, create a scorecard, right? Ed, do you ever score a city on, hey, you did a good job on this?
The answer is yes and yes. Some cities do. Some cities go through the motion. Some cities seriously take input from developers, tenants, and brokers and consultants. And what's the opportunities and what are the constraints? But again, the new companies coming in and growing in our market are unlike the companies of the last 30 years. So I have what we call a lot of legacy effect. We're still preparing for yesterday's employment sectors. And we have assumptions based on that. So it's time to reach out again in a more comprehensive manner. And what are the new industry, the new advanced sectors looking for? And then what is the opinion of the market as to how good or bad we are? And yes, there is an informal scorecard that some people keep. Again, let's imagine I'm okay with going into a region, i.e. Tri-Valley. So what's the difference between a Livermore, a Dublin, or a Pleasanton? Is it just name change? Is there a difference in property? Is there a difference in property taxes, assessments, business taxes, infrastructure, power, approval process, etc.? And then, here's my metrics for approvals. Here's my metrics for cost of rent or availability of land. Or once I rent, can I grow? Or etc. So yes, there are metrics. So cities should be aware of how they're rated.
That's good. That's a good takeaway. You, in addition to being a broker, you talked about other parts of your business where you're actually consulting with a number of cities on economic development studies. Talk to us more about the work you do and how you help cities.
Yeah, since I'm a little bit different than the average broker, who I do a lot of transactions, big and small. And again, that's a good calling and there's money in it. And I'm a good region for that purpose. But since I live in the future on half my deals, I just sold 2.5 acres by the Castro Valley Park Station. I'm about to do a hospital transaction. Probably doesn't happen until 225 down the list. I therefore have to predict timelines. I have to give a rating to my clients as to how long it takes to get something done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I live in that world. So then on the other hand, since I'm a bit of a policy wonk and I'm on regional business boards, cities then ask me, and I have cities on my boards, hey, Ed, be very specific with us. What should we be doing more than just general bromides? So then I get hired, sometimes in conjunction with an economist, sometimes with a planner or a community development person. And I operate, as I say, on the 500-foot level. How does the general plan actually affect this business park, this property? And yes, it sounds good, but what are the actual hurdles and opportunities in that given area? And so I can get rather specific for my inner consulting study as to how do you drive traffic? How do you get certain kinds of retailers? How do you, whatever. And so that's what I do in my inner consulting.
That's great just to know more about your perspective and how you work with the cities. Is you're not just a broker who's leading your industry, but you're actively involved in a number of organizations in your community, as we talked about earlier. There's probably a dozen more I didn't name in the intro, but you're actively partnering with them through these organizations, through your economic development work. And it's a good perspective for cities to go out and listen to you with how you can help develop things. I have a few takeaways from here that some of the cities should pay attention to. One is flexible zoning, how that can help attract people within limits, within certain areas of your cities. But how can you, we're not talking about making a warehouse into housing. I mean, maybe we should, but just flexible zoning. How could you take an office and put it into medical space? How could you make it a bank available to the hospital expansion next door? I heard you talk about time to permit approval process, a concierge process, just a key contact that cities can have for a business to go to. I heard you talk about the importance of developing an ecosystem, not just recruiting one business, but how do you look at the businesses you have and you can grow an ecosystem around that? And with that, the cluster effect, which is also part of that ecosystem, companies want to cluster together. We talked about water and power infrastructure. We talked about the logistic operations at secondary airports. And we challenge cities to meet with business brokers. So that's actually 7 takeaways, solid takeaways, in my opinion. That's a good value for leaders to have. Ed, do you have anything else you want to add to those takeaways or anything else you want to share?
Trucks. Okay. So right now, the latest planning mode is walkable cities. So how do we put bike paths? How do we create pedestrian-friendly cities? Meanwhile, 40% of what we consume, we order over the internet. Okay. When it comes to us, it comes in a truck. So let's talk about trucks. So first of all, we imported from overseas or from elsewhere in the West, and it comes in a big truck. That big truck needs to go to a 1,000,000 square foot depot somewhere. So Tracy and Fairfield, quote, or Livermore have big warehouses. Then it's broken down to a mid-sized truck. And then it might be broken down to your Amazon style panel truck. Okay. Everybody's now running into, we shrunk the roads to allow a bike path. So all the truck does is double park and block it. Where is the loading? Again, it's nice and it's a good value to improve bike safety. I've had my share of running into things on my bicycle. It's also fair to say that we don't want to get hit as we walk a sidewalk by a car coming on the sidewalk. But then where we have to account for logistics of the last mile, so to speak. Where do those trucks go? And how do we accommodate them? Down the road, you're going to see drones landing on top of buildings and doing freight top down. But we have to start thinking about that.
I heard Jeff Bezos speak at the venture capitalist Andreessen Horowitz group a couple of years ago. I mean, everything's a couple of years ago when you go pre-COVID. And he talked about by 2027, his goal was 75% of deliveries would take place into a form of bulk locker, right? So you start seeing those in the Whole Foods, but you also see them in apartment building complexes and places. And if they're residential suburban houses, drone delivery to your backyard. So if you think about my house, I'm sure your house is probably very similar. Open space in the backyard, right? Well, why have a driver come down the road if they can go to those logistical airports and then fly out hundreds of drones a day and land right in your backyard? Hey, it reduces traffic. It deals with the logistical challenge and can bring most packages to people. It's just something that stood out to me that he said.
That will happen, but then you're going to have privacy issues. It's not like airplanes where there's a central command that says you have this flight pattern. You're going to have individual operators with small to large size drones delivering. So you're going to see some regulation. So you don't have 25 drones running into each other or even have drone platforms. The FAA controls above 200 feet. So Amazon has already developed an elevator system where the tower goes to 210 feet on a platform, the drone lands on top of the tower, and then an elevator takes it down to a truck or to a yard. So planners now have to worry about this, not just.
All right, maybe we got off subject there, but I thought that was fascinating. But it also goes back to economic development at those airports and just some things that cities should talk about. Tell us a little bit more about yourself personally. What hobbies do you have outside of economic development and real estate?
I have several hobbies. One is I love to travel. And I've hitched around the world. Now, I was older, I can't do that as much. I'm not allowed to. So I love to travel and I love to go anywhere. And I did a bike trip down the Danube a few years ago, and we're going to do some other trips. The second thing is I have a lot of reading. I help support the libraries in the area, i.e. Walnut Creek. I have my own library, 4,000 books. Then third is I like to write. So I write poetry, short stories. If I get the time, I'll write my novel. And then I like to do things with my grandkids. And my wife is athletic and she's an adventurer just like me, soulmate. So we like to do those kinds of things.
I love biking, so I'm going to have to learn more about that trip.
One last hobby. I did construction in Alaska during college. I was an ammonia pipe fitter in Dutch Harbor. And I've been to Alaska at least 8 times doing deep sea fishing from the Bering Sea to the southeast, catching halibut, salmon, and whatever.
You're definitely active. That sounds like a lot of fun. And then last question is, how do our viewers learn more about you and connect with you?
I have a LinkedIn page and I have a high profile on various business groups. So if you just Google, you'll find my name.
Great. And we'll put all that in the show notes. Appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our sponsors, Capstone Government Affairs and Economic Development, a firm where I serve as managing partner. For more information, check us out at www.capstonegov.com. and follow us on LinkedIn by typing in Capstone Government. Thank you for listening to today's show. Check out the show notes, and for a full transcript, visit our website, www.capstonegov.com, and follow us on LinkedIn by typing in Capstone Government, or you can find me, your host, Jared Asch.